Welcome to Developing Leadership the Genuine Contact Way, where we're focused on nourishing a culture of leadership by applying timeless principles of life to the art of leadership. In each episode, we'll be exploring one key principle. We'll share our own wisdom and insights and invite you to consider your own experiences in life and business so far. And of course, how you want to further your leadership development with this theme. Our theme this week is all about assumptions. I'm Rachel Bolton, and I'm here with Birgit Williams. We want to start today by offering you some thoughts about assumptions, what they are, and where their importance lies in our lives and in our work. Assumptions are thoughts held and acted on that have not been tested to be true or false. So they're just simply some thoughts that we have. In other words, a person hears a concept and accepts it as valid, integrates the assumption into their frame of reality, either as a belief or attaching it to an existing belief, and then they begin to act from it. Assumptions can generate both expected and unexpected results. Simultaneous assumptions that conflict with each other can lead to confusion and inconsistent outcomes within oneself and, if acted on, within others as well. Traveling down a path based on assumptions that are not useful wastes time, energy, and is not productive. Inconsistent outcomes result almost always. To achieve consistency and desirable outcomes, before acting from an assumption, it's best to be aware of the assumption, name it, be aware that it is only an assumption, and test its usefulness within whatever it is that you're wanting to accomplish.
I hear people advocating to eliminate assumptions, to say, well, just simply don't have them. And I would say that is unrealistic. We have very busy minds, and those minds are making assumptions pretty much all of the time. From, like, imagine entering into a meeting room and you see other people, your mind immediately has thoughts about those other people, thoughts about the meeting. Those are assumptions at that point. It's very difficult to stop oneself from making assumptions. So we take a different tact with this leadership capacity about assumptions. It is to develop awareness about your assumptions. So yes, you have them. It's okay to have them. However, be aware of them, test their validity.
I think that idea of really developing awareness of assumptions is so important, and to be able to, in our own minds, be so clear about what is actually a fact. And we have, I think, very few of those at the end of the day in our world. And what is it that is an assumption that I'm operating from, and to be able to always carry that in our awareness, and to be able to say simply, I'm making an assumption here, and just frees up so much about how we move forward. Unfortunately, one of the things that can happen if there isn't collective agreement about being able to have those kinds of conversations is that, particularly in business organizations, when people are trying to engage in testing their assumptions and validating their assumptions as they go forward, they can suffer punitive consequences. They can be labeled as, that person who's questioning everything all the time, or the troublemaker who's trying to, especially when you poke holes in the assumptions that are not the helpful ones. And that just can have a lot of negative consequences. So as leaders, we have an opportunity to really step up into this conversation about clarifying assumptions.
And indeed, to initiate those conversations, to have the concept that assumptions are happening, and to be able to initiate conversations in a fairly neutral way that says, hey, we're going to talk about assumptions. We're going to test assumptions.
I would say that really what we're saying here is that the actual role of leadership with assumptions is creating the space for everyone to cultivate that awareness, for everyone to be feeling safe and comfortable to raise assumptions, to test them, and to validate those assumptions regardless of what the outcome of that validation is.
I love the field of science, and science quite often begins something with the word hypothesis. This is my hypothesis, as in it's something to be proven or not proven, but it begins with a hypothesis. It begins with some assumptions, and then it might be proven, and somebody else might come along with a hypothesis to build on that. And then what was once proven is left in the field of, oh no, that's actually more about assumptions that got made, but the newer science might surpass what was done at some time before. But science itself, unlike the way that media reports about science, science itself is very much about these are hypotheses that we're attempting to prove or disprove. We're testing them, and that's perfectly wonderful.
And I love science as an example because the failure of a hypothesis can be celebrated just as much as the successful proving of a hypothesis, because in either way, we get one step closer to something new, to a new outcome, to, whatever it might be. And that it's not about like all of the assumptions have to be true all the time in some perfect way. It's a beautiful example of being able to move things forward. And I know for myself, I'm super glad that science continues to move forward. If we think about what scientists and inventors believed 500 or 1,000 years ago to now, we certainly have evolved greatly. And we can do the same thing in our organizations as we work with assumptions and our evolution of our thinking and our experiences together. So if we operate from the assumption that testing and validating assumptions is an important thing, that having these conversations is important, we want to give you some opportunities to think about how you can develop your leadership capacity for working with assumptions. The first one is about getting comfortable with engaging with discussions about assumptions, as assumptions, simply as assumptions, taking some time for some personal reflection about what you need to do to develop your own mindset to handle the testing of assumptions. It can be kind of confronting when you start with it, especially when you learn all the assumptions that people are carrying that you may or may not know that they have had. This capacity development begins with you getting comfortable and engaging with discussions about these assumptions. You can do this in one way by finding a learning partner to listen to you and to then ask you as you're talking about something, is this an assumption? Or another great question is, how do you know that this is true? These two questions are great ones to keep in your back pocket with a learning partner who's helping you to get clear about your own assumptions, and also as you work with others in listening for what assumptions are in your organizations. And that leads us, of course, in those organizations to the idea of getting comfortable with the idea of creating conditions for allowing others the testing and validating of assumptions. How are you going to create that space as a leader in the organizations that you find yourself in? And the last one, then, of course, in working with assumptions, it's great to be able to practice this with a group of people and to start developing that common vocabulary with those kinds of questions of, is this an assumption? Or I have an assumption? Or how do you know that this is true?
Developing this leadership capacity for working with assumptions is simple. It's not necessarily easy. You can make it easy on yourself, but please accept that it is simple. That business of getting comfortable with engaging with discussions regarding assumptions. to simply sit within that, to breathe easily within that, and accept that assumptions are taking place within you, within everyone, and that they are so worthwhile discussing. They're worthwhile bringing to awareness. I have a funny example in my personal life. When I met Ward, he would be asking me, and this is before we got married, I'm sorry. This is in our dating relationship. We'd be conversing, and he would frequently say, "Oh, is that an assumption or is that a belief?" I would at first take offense at that. Like, well, this is clearly what I'm talking about. And then I would sit back and think, wow, that is an assumption. What is my assumption? And ultimately, that querying about assumptions and being able to talk to each other from the framework of let's test our assumptions has helped the relationship to really flourish. It's valuable. It's valuable in as a couple. It's valuable as an organization.
I think one of the things that working with assumptions does is it gives this great power, because once assumptions are unearthed and we're clear about what they are, as you were just talking about in your story, in those moments in your couplehood when you realize that there are these assumptions, you can decide if you want them to be a part of what you're taking forward together, and if they're helpful and if they're serving you in the relationship, or you in the organization working towards something, to be really clear about adopting the assumptions that are most beneficial is sort of the next level work of working with assumptions. That brings us pretty much to the end of the content we wanted to be sure that we were sharing with you today. Before we sign off, of course, I've just had my last words. Birgit, do you have any more you care to share?
I was thinking again that a choice needs to be made in terms of developing this leadership capacity within yourself. It's a choice that says, I want to get good at discussing assumptions and creating the space and conditions for others to discuss assumptions. And that is in many ways an easier conversation to invite people into than let's have a sharing of opinions. Let's have a conversation about opinions, because it's too frequent that when we enter into conversations about opinions, there's divisiveness that can happen too easily. When we invite people into conversations about assumptions, um, it, a person can have contradictory assumptions, even within their own self. And so an assumption is not good and it's not bad, and you don't have to defend it. It is simply an assumption. And how much healthier the discussions within organizations would be if we were allowed to have discussions under the topic of assumptions.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for listening. We're so glad that you were here with us in this episode today. Please do check out the next episode to continue in your learning. And before you go, be sure to hit subscribe so that you can receive notification of all of our upcoming episodes.